In this lecture, we want to begin our discussion of Heidegger's groundbreaking, legendary book, Being in Time. When Being in Time was published in 1927, it hit the philosophical world like a bolt of lightning. And we can't really understand the course of existentialism and 20th century philosophy in general without coming to some understanding of this very important book. So we'll have a series of lectures, and it's a big book, and it's a difficult book. It's a challenging book, and we won't be able to talk about everything in it, but over the next couple of lectures, at least I want to try to get some of the main themes and ideas of Heidegger's thought out in front of us. So what's this book about? Heidegger's main question is this: what is the meaning of being? Being. Being's an idea, a concept, a term that's found from the very beginnings of philosophy. And Heidegger thinks that throughout those millennia of philosophizing, philosophers have actually missed thinking about or even asking the question about the meaning of being. So how's he going to try to answer this question? Well, he's going to try to interrogate or investigate or analyze a particular kind of being, a particular kind of entity, whose being is an issue for it. Which being is that? What entity is that? His answer is Dasein, German word, Dasein. We're going to get back to that term. So his quest is to know the meaning of being. He's going to investigate a particular entity, a particular being, try to get at an answer to his pressing question. And the name of that particular being is Dasein. Okay, there it is in a nutshell. So some terminology. In the English translation, the book was written in German, Heidegger's word Sein, to be, the infinitive of to be, Sein, is translated as being with an uppercase B. And his word seinde, which is translated as a being or an entity, is translated with a lowercase b. So what's the difference between big B being and little b being? Think of it this way. Being with a little b is a thing. It's an entity. It's a something or other. Being with a big B is a way an entity is. So a human being with a little b is an entity. It's a thing. Human being with a big B is the way an entity would have to be in order to be an entity of that type, namely a human type. So all human beings with a little b are different, or at least distinct, but we all share human being. Heidegger believed that we have forgotten the meaning of big B being, not just human being, the human way, but being as such. What does it mean to be at all? In fact, he says, we are not even aware that we've forgotten. This question has been so neglected that we don't even recall having ever been a question. Yet he says we do sort of kind of know the meaning of being. What's the proof of that? Well, we all use the word is, or its cognates are, am, all the time. This is, that is, I am, you are, they are, it is. We use that word all the time, and we know how to use it. We don't feel like we're making mistakes when we use it. So we must have some kind of understanding of the meaning of being. But we don't explicitly or clearly grasp the meaning of being. And I could prove that to you, because if I asked you to define is, what would you say? And remember, you're not allowed to use the word is. You can't say, well, is blah, 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 because you've already cheated. That's a circular definition. How are you going to come at trying to understand the meaning of being, especially if I ask you to define that meaning? So before we get started, we should even ask the question, does this question matter? What's the big deal? Does the meaning of being really matter to us in any way? Well, yes. Since, as we just mentioned, we all use the word is and are and am all the time. And that means we do have a sense of the meaning of being, and that means we have a sense, anyway, of the way of things. We have an idea of the way things are. And Heidegger calls this our operative pre-understanding of being. We understand enough, so to speak, to get through the day. We have a kind of an understanding, a tacit understanding of being, enough to help us operate, help us get going and do things. And that's, includes using that word and making judgments based on that. But if we have a misguided understanding of the meaning of being, then it means we have a misunderstanding of the way of things and a misunderstanding of the way of us, of ourselves as being beings, as being entities. That could be a problem. Also, science, which we'll just define for the sake of this course as an organized body of knowledge, relies on an understanding of what is in order to undertake its investigations. I mean, science investigates what is. It doesn't investigate what isn't. So a misunderstanding of being might affect our knowledge of everything. So Heidegger wants to take us from this tacit, implicit, operative pre-understanding of being to an explicit and appropriate understanding of being. That's his philosophical project. He wants to unpack, make explicit what we implicitly grasp about the meaning of being, and therefore the meaning of everything, the meaning of what is. Now, some more terminology that you're going to face a lot in discussing Heidegger and afterwards. Ontic versus ontological. It comes from the Greek word toon, which refers to beings. Okay. Now, what's the difference between those two, ontic and ontological? Heidegger uses the two terms to refer to different kind of characteristics or different kinds of levels of study or investigation, and it's important to keep it straight when he's talking about the one and when he's talking about the other. Ontic refers to how some given entity, little b being, happens to be. Ontological refers to what it takes to be that kind of entity at all. So think of it this way. Ontological is a structure. It's not a word that Heidegger uses too often, by the way. It's not exactly the way he talks, but it's not a bad way to think. Ontological is a structure that could be filled in a variety of ways. Ontic refers to that filling in. Ontic refers to the manifestation of that structure in one way versus another. So here's a super simple non-Heideggerian example. Ontologically, it's the structure of the kind of thing that we are. Human beings think. Human beings can think. That's what it takes to be a human being, by the way, the kind of being that thinks. That was a classic determination of the human being, a thinking thing. Ontically, though, you're thinking about Heidegger right now. But at the moment, I'm thinking about pizza. All right? I'm manifesting my capacity, my structure of thinking in one way. You're manifesting it in another. But for an entity, a thing, a little b being, to think about Heidegger or pizza or whatever at all, you'd have to be structured a certain way so that you could think, or the being could think in the first place. So ontological is a structure. It's something we share. You and I share. It's not something, we don't share that structure, for instance, of thinking with computers or tables or trees, but we share it with each other. But ontically, how that shows up in our lives, how that actually gets actualized, it's going to be different for different people. Okay, so ontological is the structure. Ontic is the way that structure gets manifested in this way versus that way. Now, this graphic here gives you an idea of kind of how this works in a bigger sense. If you look at the top line, you could say ontologically, structurally, there are a bunch of different kinds of beings, a bunch of different kinds of entities. You could look at material entities or living beings or animal entities or temporal beings or written entities or spiritual beings. Okay, now if you, in order to determine those different types of entities, you would be doing what we call regional ontology. We're taking different regions of being and kind of divvying them up. We mark them out according to their characteristic structures. To be a material being is one thing, to be a living being is another thing, to be an animal is something else, to be a written or spiritual temporal being, those are something else. Once you have your ontological structural distinctions, then you can get busy with what Heidegger calls ontical sciences. So once you figure out what a material being is, then you can get busy studying them in physics or chemistry. Or once you decide what a living being is, then you can get busy studying them in biology. Or once you just decide what counts as an animal, you could get busy doing zoology. Or once you understand what it means to be temporal, then you can do history. Or what counts as written things, you could do literary studies. Or what counts as spiritual things, then you could do theology. What Heidegger is working on in this book would be something that comes before all those regional ontologies and on which all those regional ontologies are dependent. Let's call that a fundamental ontology, determining what it means to be at all. Without regard to distinctions and differences between the kinds of beings, what does it mean to be at all? That's what Heidegger's after. That's what he wants to know, the meaning of being, the meaning of Sein, the meaning of to be. So back to this problem of being. Heidegger wants to make explicit the meaning of being. That's his big philosophical project. Where can we observe being? There's only one place. In little b beings, in entities, the things that are, that which is. That's the only place you're going to find being going on. In entities. Okay? That includes everything, no matter what, so long as it is. That's the fundamental ontology. So how can I define being if it includes everything, no matter what, so long as it is? To define something, to give a definition, I need to give its genus, like what kind of a thing it is, and its species, what's distinctive about it among other things of those kind. So, for instance, I can define any entity, any little b being. For example, a desk is a piece of furniture. Furniture is its genus, meant for working on, as opposed to meant for sitting on or meant for sleeping on. That's its species, its specific difference. It's this kind of a thing, and this is what's special or specific about it. But what kind of a thing is being? What's its genus, and what's specific about it? That's what I need in order to give a definition. Well, that's the mistake. You can't define being. This is actually one of the motivations for Heidegger's investigation. Philosophers have either ignored the question of being, or they tried to define being as if it were a little b being, as if it were an entity, namely in terms of a supreme being. You've heard that phrase before. That being, which is found in everything, is one special kind of being. And Heidegger thinks that's a mistake, because think of it this way, even if there's a supreme being, even if there's a God, God is, chairs are, trees are, humans are, what does it mean to be at all, no matter what, even a supreme being? What does it mean to be? Heidegger says that when you do this, when you make the mistake of confusing big B being with little b being, with entities with their beingness, he says you're engaged in what he likes to call ontotheology. Onto, again, means thing. Theos means God. You're thinking of things in terms of a supreme being. Heidegger wants to get at being as being just insofar as it's being, no matter what it means to be. Now, traditionally, in philosophy, maybe you learned this in your earlier class, if you had me, you learned it, the study of being, qua just as a word it means as, the study of being qua being is the standard definition of the branch of philosophy called metaphysics. Metaphysics, the study of the basic nature or structure of reality. That's what metaphysics does. But think what we've heard so far. Heidegger says that even though there's been metaphysical philosophy for thousands of years, something has gone wrong. The philosophers, the metaphysicians, have been thinking about big B being, the way, as if it were a thing that's in that way. Heidegger thinks metaphysics has misunderstood being. It's been doing ontotheology instead. So he says, and this is the translation, he wants to destroy the history of metaphysics. I take a better word, and a word that's actually taken some influence in the philosophy after Heidegger is the word deconstruction. It's a word that comes from Jacques Derrida, but it could be the perfect translation of what Heidegger wants to do. He wants to unpack the history of philosophy and find out what got lost in this question of being. How did the question of being get lost? We know already it got lost by a misunderstanding of the what Heidegger calls the ontological difference, the difference between big B being and entities, things that are in being. that confusion has contributed to missing the point. But since the point has been missed and being has been misunderstood, maybe everything has been misunderstood. Maybe everything has been misunderstood in an important sense. So he wants to go back, not to get rid of metaphysics, not to trash the history of philosophy, but to go back and see what was going on in that history, to see where we got off the rails. So, okay, as you can imagine, there's problems for this project. Well, first of all, we hit one of them. How's he going to get an answer? What's the meaning of being if you can't get a definition? If you can't talk about being in terms of genus and species? And then, there was a branch that was supposed to be doing this work. That's a lot of hard work for naught, if Heidegger is right. Maybe that seems a little like a hubris there, a little prideful of Heidegger to think he's the only one that's figured it out. But, maybe. And it's, in fact, made our chances for figuring out this question even worse. And then everybody already assumes they have an understanding of being, so that they don't even see it as a problem. And again, I think we could test that by asking yourself, did you have that problem before you came to the course? Did you think to yourself, I really don't know what being means. I wish I knew. I mean, I've even taken some philosophy courses, and they're all throwing this word being around. Parmenides all the way back, way before Plato says, being is, non-being is not. There's the word. I don't think we know what that means. No, I don't think you have that problem. You use the word is and are and am all day long. You're not thinking, well, I just said this is that, but I don't know what I was talking about. You don't really have that problem. People don't think there's a problem. Not even philosophers, not even metaphysicians in a way. They think they know what it means. So, what's the problem here? And, since being refers to everything, no matter what, gods and rocks and tables and trees and numbers and money and whatever, it seems like it's too abstract to even talk about. Immanuel Kant, who we met, said, being is not a predicate. Talking about a thing's being adds nothing to knowing about that thing. I mean, the definition of, snow and the fact that snow doesn't tell you anything more about snow than the definition of snow. So what's going on with this word? It's a word that everyone uses, that so much, as we saw, depends upon, and yet it's hard to think about. It's very difficult to think about. So, if you have a goal, you need a strategy. We saw it in Descartes. Descartes had a goal of certainty. He needed a strategy. He employed methodological doubt to find what could be clear and distinct in his mind. Heidegger has a strategy. He says, look, every investigation, no matter what, has three elements. There's what you're interested in. There's got to be something you're interested in. In this case, I'm interested in being, big B being. You got to have a goal. Well, what's your interest in being? Well, my interest in being is the meaning of being. I want to know what the meaning is. And then you got to figure out what are you going to interrogate or investigate in order to reach that goal. And in this case, the only thing that you can interrogate, the only place you'll ever find big B being is in little b beings, entities, things that are. That's the only place. Okay, so there are lots and lots of entities, lots and lots of little b beings. Is there any particular being that it might be wise to start with in order to reach our goal, which is what? Figure out the meaning of being. Is there any entity? The answer is yes. There happens to be an entity, a being, a thing, a something, whose being, its way, is to question its own being. A being whose being is an issue for it. And Heidegger terms this special being Dasein. Dasein. Dasein is the being which is ontically ontological. Now, if you were paying attention earlier, we should know what that means. It's the being who happens to be, who expresses its way ontically, the being, the entity who inquires into being. In other words, it's an ontological kind of being. It's a being who's thinking about being all the time. Well, that would be a good place to start, because there's lots of entities like rocks and trees that don't have their being as an issue for it. They just are. But there is a being called Dasein, Heidegger calls Dasein, whose being, with a big B, is a question for it. It's an issue for it. Matters to it. So what is Dasein? Wrong question. The real question is, who is Dasein? Dasein comes from two German words, da, which means there, wo ist das Buch, da, where's the book, there, and Sein, to be, the infinitive to be or being. The name of the book we're studying, Being in Time, is Sein und Zeit, being and time. It's a word, if you looked it up in a German dictionary, it would say existence. But Heidegger uses this word in a very precise way to refer to the being whose being is a question for it. So to get your hands around this for a start, Dasein should be thought of as Heidegger's term for us. Us. So why not just say that? Why not say, look, there's something I'm interested in, being, there's something I want to know the meaning of being, and I need to investigate something, and is there anything special I should investigate? Yeah, how about human beings? Or consciousness, or the human soul, or the subject, or the person. Why not use one of those words we're all very familiar with? The answer is Heidegger wants to defamiliarize us with ourselves in the hopes that we could see ourselves with new eyes. He thinks because we've misunderstood being, we've misunderstood human being. And if we misunderstand human being, and talk about ourselves as consciousnesses or rational animals or souls or subjects or persons, we may be missing something profoundly important about us that we haven't noticed. It's been invisible to us. He doesn't want us to come into this investigation of being with any kind of preconceived notions or prejudices. Anyway, to the extent that that's possible, and we'll have to talk about that. It's not perfectly possible, as you'll see. But that's the goal here. That's his trick. So translators just leave the word Dasein. They don't translate it. Because if you were a German reader and you were reading this book in German, and quite frankly, you probably wouldn't find it too much easier if you were a native speaker of German than you are, and you'll find it as an English reader in the translation. It would be just as puzzling what Heidegger is doing with this word Dasein. He's trying to defamiliarize everybody, not just English speakers, but German speakers as well. So it actually helps, in this one case anyway, to be a reader of a translation, because we see this funny word Dasein, which we don't use in English at all, and it makes us stop. Wait a minute, I don't know what that is. I don't know exactly what he's talking about there. Heidegger says, great. That's what I'm talking about. I got you right where I want you now. I want you to try to come at this without too many preconceptions. Now, okay, so he's doing ontology. He's trying to figure out the meaning of being, but he says it's going to turn out that ontology must be done phenomenologically. It must be phenomenology. Now, we talked about this in an earlier lecture. Phenomenology is a descriptive philosophy. It doesn't start, or at least it purports not to start with any prepackaged theoretical assumptions, but tries to approach things as they give themselves to us in experience. So if he's after being, he doesn't want to start with some kind of preconceived metaphysical theory or system about being. He wants to see how being shows itself to us, how it presents itself to us. Not the way they say it's supposed to be, but how does it actually give itself to us? For Heidegger, those prepackaged theoretical assumptions are what he calls metaphysics. And for Heidegger, metaphysics is kind of a bad word because it makes mistakes. I mean, it's a nice project. It's kind of like his project. That's kind of what he wants to do. But he says, look, I'm just going to give those guys the word metaphysics because they've gone off the rails. I'm going to do something else here. I'm going to do a fundamental ontology and, relook at this. Right? I don't want to start with metaphysics or any of the ontic sciences like physics or psychology or sociology or all those things that are based on metaphysical views of being, because they may prejudice us into thinking about ourselves in ways that are less than adequate to what we're really all about. In order to understand Dasein's being, to do an ontological study of Dasein, we have to begin not theoretically or metaphysically, but phenomenologically. So a question that comes up early in this project is this circular? Heidegger's point, though, remember, is that we both do and don't have an understanding of being. His strategy is to try to move from inquiring about or analysis of the being of those special beings whose mode of being is to question being, in other words, us, Dasein, And he wants to get from that to the meaning of being. So just to give you a heads up where we're going, the existentialists and Heidegger are going to butt heads later on. The existentialists are going to see what Heidegger's doing as essentially about us human beings. And Heidegger says no. I have to work with human beings, Dasein he calls us. I have to work with that to get where I want to go. But once I get where I want to go, I don't care about humans anymore. I'm not interested specifically about humans. I'm interested in being, which applies to everything that is, not just us. Whereas the existentialists like Sartre and Beauvoir and Camus and Marcel and so many others, they just stay with us, what it means to be a human being. Heidegger gave them lots of tools for that kind of philosophical reflection. But for him, it was a process he had to get through and get beyond. And later in his philosophy, he does try to get beyond that. So this is what Heidegger's doing. So his point would be, look, if you want to investigate something, you have to already know a little something in order to even know what you're looking at, to even know what you want to ask, to even know how you want to investigate or analyze. So you can't start from scratch. You can't start from zero in this or any genuine intellectual pursuit. You can never start from zero. If you're hearing that point, you already know that Heidegger is going to have a problem with Descartes, because what did Descartes try to do? Remember, try to dump all those apples of our sources of knowledge onto the ground and start from scratch to find a new foundation. Heidegger is going to argue throughout this book. In fact, that's a main target of his criticism is Descartes, this idea of foundationalism, this idea that you can start from scratch. Heidegger says you can't. There's no way to do that. That would be utopian. The word utopia literally means no place. Topos means place, like topography, and U is the alpha privative, we call it. It would be an A in English. No place, right? And Heidegger's going to show us that human beings are always emplaced. You can never be a non-placed utopian entity. You have to start from where you are, moving from the implicit to the explicit. But then, once we go through this process with Heidegger, once we make explicit our operative pre-understanding of being, then we got to move back to find out what was implicit in all that we learned. What does that imply? What are the implications? What are the takeaway of what we've made explicit? And that's going to require hermeneutics, another important word. Hermeneutics is a word that refers to interpretation. It's literally your understanding of how you interpret, your way of interpreting. Comes from the name of the Greek god Hermes, who was the messenger of the god. And hermeneutics is started as a field of literary study where you had a text, the Bible, and you wanted to know what the message was. And then that expanded to all kinds of texts, not just scriptural texts. What do these texts really mean? And then people eventually, especially after Heidegger, begin to see that life itself is kind of like metaphorically, like a text that requires interpretation, inescapably requires interpretation. So Heidegger's going to say that hermeneutics, interpretation, is part of the ontology of Dasein, part of the ontology of us. It's part of our makeup. We are the interpreting beings. It's not just something we do on occasion. It's the way we are all the time as Dasein, as human beings, as we'll see. I'm just stating that now, but I'll show you this. So that means that if you're going to do phenomenology, it must be hermeneutical. Right? If you're going to do an ontology, it's got to be phenomenological. You have to start with how things show themselves, not how they theoretically are supposed to be. And then if you're going to let things show themselves, it's going to require hermeneutics. It's going to require interpretation. Now go back to Husserl, who we talked about. Remember, he wanted to bracket out all theoretical points of view, but also bracket out the natural attitude and start with a pure givenness of things, to have a presupposition-less science. Again, it's a kind of foundationalism. It's a project that follows on the heels of Descartes, despite his understanding of phenomenology and how that set loose Heidegger and after him Sartre. we remember Husserl missed the boat here. He thought that by bracketing out, by effecting the phenomenological reduction, we called it, that we could just set aside all the interpretations and just let things show themselves. And Heidegger thinks that's impossible. And sorry, it's impossible. You can never start from scratch. We always have presuppositions, prejudgments, prejudices. Let that sink in. If we go around the world trying to eradicate prejudice, literally prejudice, I don't mean superficial, mean-spirited prejudice. Let's get rid of those. But if you said, I don't have any prejudgments on anything, you can't do it. Think of your presuppositions, your operative pre-understanding, your prejudices, if you want to say that, as lenses with which to view reality. And if you didn't have some lenses at all, you couldn't view reality at all. You couldn't be human. You couldn't be aware of anything. So we're going to learn that interpretation and therefore hermeneutics is an inextricable feature of what it means to be Dasein. You can't avoid interpretation. You can only have better and worse interpretations. A couple things to say about this. Sometimes when you're in an argument with somebody or you're listening to two people argue over something and it's getting kind of heated, somebody will say at one point, well, that's just your interpretation. That's just your interpretation. It's the problem is going to be with the word just, as in mere. The person is saying like, well, you're interpreting that, but for me, what I'm saying, that's the way it is. That's the truth with a capital T. The problem there is the person's right when you say that's an interpretation because everything is. The problem is when you dismiss it as mere just because it's an interpretation. The flip side of that is when somebody learns that, hey, listen, it's all interpretation all the way down, then who cares what you think? It's all just an interpretation. It's all mere. Both of those views are wrong. They're misguided, tremendously misguided. The fact that we have to come to grips with is that we are the beings of interpretation. That things don't just give themselves to us with a firm foundation of certainty, however much Descartes wanted to try to find it. We always come at things, as Nietzsche would say, from a perspective. Nietzsche said it starkly. There's no truth, only perspective. And people think that was a gotcha. Hey, Nietzsche, what you said right there, is that the truth? Nietzsche says, no, it's not a gotcha. So much the better. That's my perspective, and as Nietzsche liked to say, no one's easily entitled to my opinion. Right? Opinions, truths as we call them, facts as we call them, are interpretations. They are interpretations. The word fact literally means to make, like manufacture means to make by hand. Right? Facture by manu, make by hand. It's a making. We make facts. We make interpretations that are better by having procedures, testing each other again, and so forth. And you got other people who have interpretations that come from the thin air. It just comes wherever. There's better and worse interpretations. There's only interpretations, but there's certainly better and worse, and it certainly does not mean you could think whatever you want, anything goes. Nope, you could be wrong. Can you be absolutely wrong? Well, just throw out the idea of absolutes. That's utopian. What we have is a contest of interpretations. That's our life. So hermeneutics is the theory of interpretation. It's a reflection on how one interprets and where those interpretations come from and how they operate. So phenomenology, which is descriptive, can only be done hermeneutically, despite whatever Husserl wants. That's it. A note, pre-modern and modern times, modern philosophical, intellectual times, were organized on the basis of absolutes. In the pre-modern time, in the ancient time, there was Platonic forms that were eternal and unchanging. In the Middle Ages, the medieval time, the age of faith, the absolute was God and the supreme being and the commandments. In our times, our postmodern times, what postmodern really means is the recognition, the becoming enlightened to the fact that facts are interpretations and are characterized by hermeneutics. It makes hermeneutics all important. Existentialism then should be characterized as a hermeneutic phenomenology, an interpretive, descriptive experience of how things present themselves, where we are, not from some utopian place or timeless eternal place, but from where we are. Now, another terminological distinction, existence versus being. If you, again, just use a normal dictionary, look them up, you might see that they were synonyms. But for Heidegger, they're not synonyms. For Heidegger, all beings are, like they're in being, but only Dasein exists. I repeat, that doesn't mean that only Dasein is, that only human beings are. That's weird. That's obviously wrong. There's all kinds of stuff around us. He means that only Dasein's being, Dasein's big B being, its way, is to exist. So now we got to figure out what he means by exist. To exist means literally to stand outside of, existere. Dasein is the kind of being that stands out. All right, what's it stand out from? Its own being, its own way. Heidegger says Dasein's essence, the essence of something is what it takes to be that thing, the key to what it is to be that kind of thing. He says Dasein's essence is existence. Now, if you've studied a little bit of philosophy before, you say, I think I recognize that phrase, something's essence is its existence. And that, what you're recognizing maybe is that's the traditional formula that pertains to God alone. That's how Thomas Aquinas would put it. But that's not what Heidegger is saying here. He's not saying that human beings are essentially God. What he's saying is what it means to be us is about this kind of existing, this standing out. So it's never the case that Dasein just is or simply is like a chair or coffee cup. Dasein has to decide what it will be, how it will be. It has to take a stance on its own being. It stands out from whatever it's been so far to determine what it's going to try to be next. That's the kind of being we are. With a chair or coffee cup, you could say it is what it is. With Dasein, you can never say that. You can only say Dasein is what it might be. And that's what existence means for Heidegger. Dasein's being is may being. We're all going around maybeing, right? Think about that. That's what we are. Whatever we are is what we may be, and we may be something else. Dasein's being is possibility. For Heidegger, he says this explicitly, possibility is higher than actuality when it comes to Dasein. For everything else, it's probably the opposite, right? Like what's better, a possible $100 or an actual $100? I don't know about you, but I take the actual $100. I take that. But what does it mean when he says when it comes to Dasein, possibility is higher than actuality? What he means is whatever you are today, a process of at least 18 and maybe lots more years, if like in my case, whatever you are today, whatever you've actualized today, that's what you are. That's what Heidegger will call your facticity. Facts about you. Whatever that is, more important than that is what all that might mean, where all that might go, what might happen with all that. Take anything that's a fact about you, anything that's actualized about you. You were a student in the spring semester 2020, COVID-19 hit, we all had to pivot, and you thought you were taking classes in the classroom, and all of a sudden you were on Zoom. That's a fact. You can't be in denial about that. You say, no, I was really in the classroom. No, you were on Zoom. That's a fact. But what was that? Well, it wasn't any set thing. Your facticity is not your fate, as you'll hear me say. You know, that happened. There's no denying it. That's a bell that you can never unring. But what will it have meant? We don't know yet. Everything about human beings is TBD, as we say, to be determined when it comes to Dasein. So how do we talk about Dasein? Well, traditionally, following Aristotle's Categories, which is a text, that's the name of a book of Aristotle. It's the first one in the whole library of Aristotle's books, by the way. What we do is we employ a general set of characteristics, Aristotle called them categories, to describe any kind of being, any kind of entity. So here's Aristotle's, we'll see Aristotle's list in a minute. Heidegger calls the kind of being, the kind of way of things, entities, little b beings, the kind of being that can be rightly described by the categories, Heidegger calls being present to hand. Okay, that's something you want to recall. You want to remember this term, being present to hand. There are certain kinds of things that their way is being present to hand. And those kind of things can be described quite well using Aristotle's categories. But when it comes to Dasein, we're going to need a different set of characteristics to talk about us, to talk about a being whose being is existence, to talk about a being that's not just is what it is, to talk about a being whose being is an issue for it. And Heidegger's going to call this new list of characteristics, he's going to call them existentials or existentiales. So there's two kinds of things. One of them is being present to hand. The other is Dasein. You could talk about beings present to hand with the categories. You could talk about Dasein with a list of characteristics called existentials. Now what we're going to do going forward is make ourselves a nice big list of these characteristics, a nice big list of existentials as we go along, a nice big list of terms that are more apt for using in talking about us than these categories that we use to talk about coffee cups and tables. Right? Heidegger's problem is that the tradition talks about Dasein as if it were just another thing. But like he likes to say, Dasein is not a what, Dasein is a who. If you got a what, Aristotle's categories will work great. If you got a who, they're always going to be misleading. I mean, you could do it, but it's misleading. So here's Aristotle's categories, the 1b25. If you've studied Aristotle, you know that's the line number. And where you'll find this in the original Greek. So it's on page 1. To the back side, the B side. So right at the beginning of all of Aristotle's work. So here's it. When you're talking about something, you could talk about it as a substance. And we met that word earlier. When a philosopher talks about substance, they're talking about a real thing. So a man is a substance, a horse is a substance. And then we could talk about its quantity. It's 4 foot or 5 foot or it weighs 20 pounds. Qualifications, these are Aristotle's words. They're white or grammatical, yellow. Relative, so when you're talking about something, you could say it's double that or half the other one or larger than something else. It has a location. It has a where. It was in the Lyceum or it's in the marketplace. That's where the horse was. When was it? Well, that was there yesterday. And it could be in a position. It was sitting on the man. Or the man was sitting on it. The horse was shod or it had armor on. It was doing something. The man was like cutting some wood or burning some wood. Or it could be being affected, doing or having done to it. So it's being cut or being burned. And these categories, will amply describe an object, a thing, a being present to hand. Being present at hand. Yeah. They won't apply to us. Now you say, wait a minute. I'm a human being. I'm 5.5 feet tall. I speak. I'm larger than my grandson. I'm in Pennsylvania. I'm standing up. I'm shoeless. I'm talking. I'm having light from my lamp shine on me. Don't these categories work for me? Yes, because we can and usually do think about human beings, think about Dasein, as if what we fundamentally are is a what. When we think about ourselves as a what, we talk about ourselves that way. And we can, and sometimes there's a reason to do so. But that's not going to get to the essence of us. It's not going to get to existence. It's not going to get to possibility. It's not going to get to maybeing. An analysis of Dasein requires this other list that we'll be making as we go through the book. So here's some more terminology, just get straight about this idea of existentials. Heidegger says when you talk about us, you have to talk about existentials. Existentials are ontological structures that make up Dasein as such. Because you and I will be characterized by certain existentials, ontically, that will show up in your life one way, and ontically, it will show up in my life in a different kind of way, maybe. Right? But structurally, ontologically, we are all structured by or characterized by this set of existentials which we will build. Okay, so we're going to, and Heidegger says when we do manifest these existential structures one way versus another, he's going to use the word existentiel. So an existential is a structure, existentiel is an expression or a manifestation of that structure. Existentials are a list of the characteristics of the ontology of Dasein. Existential expressions are the ontic expressions of Dasein. So existential is to ontological as existential is to ontic. Okay. Again, if it were one of these existentials to think, which it's not on the list, that would be an ontological feature of us. Existential would be I'm thinking of pizza and you're thinking of Heidegger. All right. We'll clarify these with examples as we go along. Heidegger's examples, not thinking, not a good example for Heidegger. All right. So what he's proposing then to do is an existential analytic of Dasein. He's going to come up with an analysis of the kind of being whose being is to exist, to stand out, to take a stance, and he's going to generate a list of characteristics that will help us understand more deeply our way of being. Here are some of the first existentials. Let's start our list now, and you're going to want to keep this list. First thing he notices is Dasein is in each case mine. The German word is Gemeinigkeit, which is literally always minishness, if you were translating the German. What he means is Dasein always says I or we, but usually I. Dasein, the kind of being that you have and that I have, is my being. I'm not you. I'm not anything else. I'm a being who says I. I'm a first person kind of being. That's not true of there's no I for my coffee cup. There's no I for a tree. No, but what you are ontologically is an I. You are in each case your own. And Dasein's essence, we already actually got this one, is existence. Our being is always an issue for us. Our being matters to us. Our being is always in question for us. So, Gemeinigkeit, in each case minus, and existence. Two things that apply to Dasein that don't apply to beings present at hand, like coffee cups and tables and cars. Now, a very important word, not just for Heidegger, but for all of existentialism. One might even say, look, what's the point of even studying existentialism? Like, tell me in one word, while standing on one foot, tell me in a word, what's the point of studying existentialism? You could do worse than to say the point is authenticity. The point is authenticity. It's a key idea for Heidegger. Same with Sartre and Beauvoir and everybody else that we'll talk about. Authenticity. So we got a lot to say about it. Here's the first look. You can think about this. Since Dasein is in each case mine, and Dasein is existence, meaning our being is an issue for it, Dasein can either be authentic or inauthentic. Now, in German, Heidegger pays very, very close attention to words. He thinks words speak to us. It's not just that we speak words, but words can speak to us. Words reveal things to us. Language is disclosive. He's very insistent upon that. And he's playing on this German word eigen, which means own. Dasein is in each case Eigentlichkeit, is mineness, okay? My own, as in my own. Dasein's always that way. The Greek word for own is autos, right? Which is also translated, if you looked up in a Greek dictionary, autos, you'd see self, from which we get, for instance, the English word autonomy, meaning what? Rule by or rule of one's own self. So Dasein is a self. The question is going to be whether Dasein is one's own self. Now you would think that's a redundancy. Autos, eigen, self, that's all coming from the same word. To be one's own, is to be a self. All right? So how could there be a question? Well, it turns out there is. We're always an I. We are always our own. But often, in fact, Heidegger will say, almost always, we are never really our own self. We're a self. We're an I. It never really goes away. But who's that I? Who is that I? Is it my own I or whose? That's going to be the question that Heidegger's going to ask. If it's my own I, authentic. If the I that I am is not really my own, inauthentic. Right? The word authentic, again, comes from that Greek word autos. In German, it's eigentlich. So authenticity is Eigentlichkeit. There's that word eigen again. To be authentic is to be one's own self. Now, if you've encountered me before, I always like to say, you got to do two things. You got to figure out what exactly a philosopher is trying to tell you, and then you got to decide for yourself whether you think they're right. Heidegger says your being is always an issue for you. That's his claim. But is it? Are you walking around going, well, what about my being? What shall I make of my being? Is that always an issue for me? Because Heidegger says it is. Because you're Dasein, so am I. Right. Now, does that mean that every human being is an ontologist? Every human being is a philosopher that studies Heidegger's texts and texts in metaphysics or whatever, working out this explicit meaning of being? If that's what he means, he's clearly wrong. I know my mom doesn't do that. My grandkids don't do that. But they're all Dasein. So maybe, and I think probably Heidegger noticed that not everybody's an ontologist like he was. So what does he mean? It means that you make decisions all the time about what you're going to do next. All the time. All of your waking life. In every moment. You don't just stand there going, well, let's see where I go next. Even if you want to do that, that's a decision. To stand there wondering what's going to happen next. That's a choice. That's a decision you made. Right? The question is going to be just how you make those decisions. But it'd be hard to deny that you're forever deciding things. Even if you let somebody else decide, you decided to not decide. Right? What Heidegger says that your being is always an issue for you, he means you're always deciding. You might be deciding explicitly, you might be deciding after a long period of reflection and reasoning, or you might just be, quote unquote, going with the flow. It's all a decision. And that's certainly something that all existentialists will agree with. Okay, so now Heidegger wants to say a little bit more about the kind of being Dasein is, and he wants to add a new existential to the list. Besides existence and being in each case mine, he's also going to say that we are being in the world. Now, the hyphens are important, so when you're writing something about Heidegger and you're talking about being in the world, you must include the hyphens. Okay, you must. Why? Because it indicates a fundamental unity, which Heidegger is going to talk about. One of the questions he's going to raise is, what does it mean to be in the world? What does it mean to be in? What does it mean? What does world mean? He's going to ask about every bit of this phrase. But this being in the world is actually a feature of what it means to be Dasein. It's really part of his core argument against Descartes again. As like I said, it's probably his main philosophical opponent here. Descartes left us in a weird position with his philosophy, that here we are, this ghost in the machine. There's me, this thinking thing, immaterial, invisible, not unnatural, and over there is a world, material, extended, mappable, nature, and maybe others. And how do I connect? Heidegger's understanding of us in terms of the existential, of being in the world, is his way to show that René Descartes' philosophy leads to absurdity. Now, what does he mean? Let's take part of it. What does he mean by being in? So, question, is Dasein in the world like my sofa is in my living room? Right? You could look at it this way. I'm in the living room, and my sofa is in the living room, and the living room's in the house is in the city, and the city's in the nation is on the earth is in the solar system is galaxy, and the galaxy's in the universe. Like a set of those, nesting dolls, those Matryoshka nesting dolls. You could look at it that way. But Heidegger says I am in the living room in a way that's different than the way the sofa's in the living room. He says I dwell in the living room. It would be weird and that makes sense. I dwell in my house. It'd be weird to say my sofa dwells in my house. My coffee cup dwells in I dwell in my house. In fact, Heidegger, in German, ich bin, I am, he traces that I am to the word for dwelling, even to be, right? Ich bin is from the infinitive Sein, to be. I am. Ich bin ein Berliner, as Kennedy once said. I am a jelly donut. No, sorry. I am a citizen of Berlin. Heidegger's saying that word am, that being word there, has roots in a word that means dwell. So he wants to talk about the spatiality of Dasein, which he talks about in various places in Being Time. So here's an observation. Let's just ponder this for a second. A book cannot touch a table. Heidegger says a chair cannot touch a wall in a book. A book cannot touch a table. Why? Is it because there's always some, microscopic little air gap between the book and the table? No. The being, the big B being, the way of books and tables is not such that they can touch. Their being may be described as being present at hand. The kind of thing you could describe with Aristotle's categories. Only Dasein, a whole different way of big B being, different way, can truly touch a book or a table. Is that because we're conscious and books or tables aren't conscious? That's another, it's the same kind of question as why does he say Dasein? Why doesn't he just say human being or rational animal or something like that? Same thing here. Why didn't he just say conscious? We're conscious, books and tables aren't. Again, he wants to say that if you use that word consciousness, you have a whole psychological, physical theory of consciousness that's, constraining how you think about things. And Heidegger wants us to proceed phenomenologically, and he doesn't want to use any kind of theoretically loaded terms like consciousness at this point. So he's just saying that it's our way of being is a kind of encountering, and touching is about encountering, and we can encounter things because we have the being of Dasein. That's our way. But books and tables are not such that they can encounter anything. Only Dasein can encounter. We have a different kind of spatiality. Later on, Heidegger will talk about distance, and he'll say fundamentally, what's distance all about? It's about feet and inches. Is that what it's all about? Is that what distance really is? The kind of thing you can do in with geometry and mathematics? He says no. He says, right now, for instance, I'm closer to my granddaughter out in Western PA than I am to the microphone that's right in front of me. Now you say, wait a minute, you're only 12 inches away from the microphone in front of you. You're 300 and some miles away from your granddaughter out in Western PA. No, aren't you closer to the microphone? No, you know what I'm saying. Closeness for Dasein is about what matters, what we encounter, how we encounter things. Heidegger would say if I'm enjoying a beautiful painting on a wall, the painting is closer to me than the glasses through which I'm looking at the painting, without which I couldn't see the painting or the wall probably at this point. That's the kind of being that Dasein has. Now, because our spatiality works like that, then sure. Sometimes, because I'm close to my granddaughter, I want to know in miles how far away it is, because I want to know how much gas I need to buy for my car in order to get that many miles to go see my granddaughter. All right. So, but the point he's trying to make is that geometrical feet and inches understanding of distance and space is founded upon this phenomenological understanding of spatiality in terms of Dasein's encounters and distancing, and our ability to touch and encounter things. So how do we encounter? What he's doing here is opposing what he thinks is a prejudice, the modern philosophical prejudice of epistemology as first philosophy. We learned that with Descartes. He switched the game. In the ancient world, metaphysics was first philosophy. What is there really? When it comes to Descartes, his primary question was, what can I know for sure? What can I know with certainty? And modern philosophy believes that our fundamental encounter with things is a matter of knowing, tied to the Greek word theoria, which means kind of seeing by gazing upon things, as Heidegger puts it. Heidegger thinks that knowing, and therefore epistemology, is a founded mode of engagement. There's a more primordial form of engagement that comes first. And because of that mode of engagement for us, Dasein, we can then later have this superstructure, so to speak, of knowledge and epistemology. And I just gave you a good example of that. We'd never talk about feet and inches if we didn't have an idea of spatiality that has more to do with closeness in terms of, like, I'm really close to my granddaughter and my grandson out in Western PA. All right. So Heidegger says this: we first find ourselves in an environment. The German word is Umwelt. The word means around, right? The around world, the world around us. We find ourselves in an environment in which we are circumspect. Umsicht. He's playing on that for around. We're in an environment around us, and we're looking around concernfully. We're not just staring at something in isolation from everything else. We're engaged and encountering that world. To use Aristotle's terminology, and I should say this for anybody who wants to dig deeper into this, a lot of what Heidegger does in this book, Being in Time, is a kind of a rewrite of aspects of Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics, in particular his ideas about phronesis in this particular case. Aristotle privileges theoria. He thinks that's the epitome of the humanity, a kind of knowing that attains the status of wisdom by seeing dispassionately what is. Heidegger privileges phronesis, our practical or pragmatic way of making our way through the world. There's a wisdom that comes from that, and because there is, we could, don't have to, but we could look at things theoretically. Heidegger gives us a great example. There's a very famous example of hammering. He gives the example of a carpenter in a workshop, section 16 of the book. The carpenter hammers nails into boards. The carpenter's not engaged with the hammer in some kind of knowledge relationship. Put it this way, the carpenter's not thinking about the hammer. The carpenter has a hammer and is pounding away on nails, making a bookcase or whatever, whistling, and doesn't, think about the hammer. Now, there's a knowledge there. Don't get me wrong. He doesn't hammer with a screwdriver, often, but she or he takes the hammer and just hammers away. There's no scientific, theoretical knowledge of what a hammer is. So what Heidegger thinks this shows that our primordial encounter with things appropriates those things as what he calls tools or equipment. And that way of being, he calls being ready to hand. Now remember, we already met being present to hand, which is just an object as such that you could talk about according to those Aristotelian categories. Stuff, what's. But now he's saying our first encounter with the world is an encounter based on toolness, equipmentality, being ready to hand, hammers. The point is the carpenter just kind of hammers away, and you could test this, right? Okay, right now you are probably viewing a computer screen. But until this exact moment in this lecture, you are not thinking of your computer screen or your speaker system. Those are your tools. You weren't thinking of them at all. Maybe you're wearing a belt or shoes. But again, at this moment, until I said that, you weren't thinking of them. You weren't aware of them at all. You were using them. You were in the midst of an engagement. And the world around you is not a world of objects, next to the next to the next to the next. The world for you is this engagement with the project you happen to be working on at the moment, which is listening to a lecture on Heidegger. Right, you don't notice them. And so long as all goes well, the carpenter just hammers, or you just look at your screen. And you're not even looking at the screen. You're looking at slides. You're listening to me. You're not listening to your speaker. You're listening to me. You're not thinking about the speaker. And so long as everything works, we just go with the flow. Right? Heidegger says this points to another existential of Dasein. Call it concern. We concern ourselves with our tools. Things take on this pragmatic use meaning for us. It's not just some brute isolated thing, but the meaning it has is because we concern ourselves with our being. And what does that mean? That means we're deciding what we're going to do. And I've decided, for instance, to make bookcases. So I decide to pick up a hammer and start hammering. I have concerned not even so much with the hammering or the bookcase, but with having my book somewhere in the end. Right? We're concerned with the world around us. Every Dasein is structurally concerned. Right? You got to hear that. He's not saying Dasein may or may not be concerned. He's not saying Dasein has the capacity to be concerned, which maybe it will or won't exercise. Heidegger is saying ontologically you are concern. You're best described as concern. A good way to talk about what it means to be Dasein or what it means to be you is concern, engagement with things, right? It's not just something going on with us from time to time. It's who we are. Now you say, man, sometimes I'm not concerned. You're like, I hear what's going on in the news. I'm not concerned, right? I'm not bothering about that. But you're bothering about something else, if you want to put it that way. You can even show your concern negatively, Heidegger's going to say. So, for instance, if when I'm finished hammering, if I wipe down the hammer and I put it back in its toolbox and I treat it with loving care, that's concern. Heidegger would also say if I got done with hammering and I just threw it on the floor and ran the car over it, that would also be concern. So in our, the way we talk, we could say concern could be positive or negative, but it's always concern. You're dealing with that hammer one way or another all the time. And he gives some Ontic examples of concern. Concern's a structure. How does it show up? He says, well, having to do with something, producing something, attending to something, looking after it, making use of something, giving something up, letting it go, undertaking, accomplishing, the whole list there, right? Those are all ways that concern gets manifested ontically. And this brings us to another term, another existential of Dasein, facticity, right? It's a piece of our puzzle of what it means to be Dasein. What Heidegger means here is that because we are beings of concern, we are the beings about whom there are facts. Some are determined by our thoughts and choices and actions and the possibilities that we've actualized. A fact about me is I'm a professor because I made choices in life. Some are determined outside our control. I'm American. I didn't ask to be born here. That's where I showed up. That's it. But all of those things, the ones that are a result of your choices, the ones that are a result of the choices of others, or some that are a result of natural goings on, those are your facts, and there can be facts about you because structurally you're a being of facticity. Our facticity represents the bells about us that cannot be unrung. That's how I put it. It's not Heidegger, right? It's I was born in Pennsylvania. There's no way to undo that fact, right? I started this lecture, 30 minutes ago. There's no way to undo that fact. That's a fact. Those are facts. They are facts about me because I'm the being about whom there can be facts. Our facticity, as you heard me say earlier, is not fate. Facticity is the other pole of possibility. Each fact about us is what? Really a new possibility. In other words, it's all in how we interpret the facts. For example, this quarantine. Some people found it easy and they really thrived in it. Some found it very difficult and they're struggling with it. But it was the same quarantine. What's made of that is up to each Dasein. So insight comes then when things go wrong. Right? We always curse when things go wrong. But, what if that hammer breaks? The carpenter would notice right away and be thinking of the hammer as a tool. To all of a sudden look at the hammer and go, hey, wait a minute. This piece of equipment, it's a being ready to hand that's not so ready anymore. It's not functioning very well. Right? And at this point, when it breaks or when it goes missing or I've backed the car up over it and I can't get it out from under the tire, whatever it is, I recognize what a tool really is. It's not just a thing isolated in itself, without regard to anything else. A hammer is an in order to. Your computer screen, what is it? It's an in order to. Your shoes, what are they? An in order to. A hammer is in order to hammer nails. Nails are in order to fasten boards. Boards are in order to have bookcases. Bookcases are in order to hold books. Books are in order to memorialize knowledge. And Heidegger says, strictly speaking, then, there is no such thing as a tool or an equipment in isolation. Each equipment, each tool points to other equipment. Hammers and nails and boards and brackets and screws and so forth. All of those interconnected in order tos also have what Heidegger calls a for the sake of which. I hammer for the sake of having a place to hold my books. But that makes the ultimate for the sake of which of everything is Dasein, the being whose being is an issue for, the being whose being might manifest itself in wanting to have a bunch of books around and therefore needing some place to hold them orderly. It means having a bookcase, which means having wood, which means having hammers and nails and carpenters because of Dasein. So where does science come from on this? Heidegger, is basically trying to say that science, that looking at things in terms of the Aristotelian categories, looking at everything as if it were just present at hand all by itself, not caught up in this interconnected network of equipment and so forth. Where does that come from then? Well, go back to the broken hammer. First, we noticed that the hammer is a tool. Then, since the tool can no longer fulfill its in order to, we view the tool simply as an object now, a present at hand, no longer ready to hand. And then we can look at it, or Heidegger says, gaze upon it now according to those Aristotelian categories. Why did it break? Was it too heavy, too light? What kind of physical structure? What's the molecular makeup of this thing? Why did it break so easily? Maybe I should make it out of something else. We can look at it. We can theorize it. What should a hammer be? And this, Heidegger says, is the beginning of science. Science, primarily physics, can happen once things are removed from their interconnected web of meaning and significance. The hammer as thing rather than hammer as tool. The hammer as present at hand rather than hammer as ready to hand. So the conclusion here for Heidegger is that science, knowledge, which the tradition always says comes first. We encounter the world as something we know. Heidegger says that's not first. We encounter the world because of our pragmatic engagement with the world. And if we weren't pragmatically, practically engaged with the world, we would never get to the point where we would look at things as pure objects, isolated from everything else. So long as everything were going completely swell, there might never have been science as you and I understand it. Now, things don't go swell, so not to worry. We have science. And it's a good thing we do. So make a point. Heidegger is not against science, not at all against science. All he's saying is science is founded upon something more primordial. Our Dasein's being in a world in which we are all pragmatically engaged. All right, let's take a break right there. That'll be lecture 1. We'll pick it up next time.